Please welcome Wade Davis.
Well, good morning, everybody. One of the great pleasures of travel, as I'm sure you've experienced, is the opportunity to live amongst those who have not forgotten the old ways, who still feel the past in the wind. And could we have the first image up, please? Still feel the past in the wind, touch it in stones polished by rain, taste it in the bitter leaves of plants. And just to know, as we sit here today in Rancho Mirage, in the Amazon, jaguar shamans still journey beyond the Milky Way. And in the high Arctic, the myths of the Inuit still resonate with meaning. And in the Himalaya, the Buddhists still pursue the breath of the Dharma. And this is to remember the central revelation of anthropology, and that is the idea that the social world into which you were born does not exist in some absolute sense, but is just one model of reality, the consequence of one particular set of adaptive choices that your cultural lineage made, however successfully, many generations ago. But whether it is a voodoo acolyte in Haiti, a yak herder on the slopes of Chomolungma, an eagle hunter of Kazakhstan, or a thunderhoof shaman of Mongolia, all of these peoples teach us that there are other ways of being, other ways of thinking, other ways of orienting yourself in social, ecological, spiritual space. And that's an idea that, if you think about it, can only fill you with hope. Now, together, the myriad of cultures of the world make up a sort of social web of life that envelops the planet and is as important to the well-being of the planet as is the biological web of life that you know so well as a biosphere. And in an early book, I coined the term ethnosphere to create an organizing principle. And I defined the ethnosphere as a sum total of all thoughts and intuitions, ideas, beliefs, and memories brought into being by the human imagination since the dawn of consciousness. The ethnosphere is humanity's great legacy. It's a symbol of all that we've achieved and the promise of all that we can achieve as a wildly creative species. And just as the biosphere has been severely impacted with the loss of habitat, the loss of plant and animal life, so too is the ethnosphere. No biologist would dare suggest that 50% of species are moribund, and yet that, the most apocalyptic scenario in the realm of biological diversity, scarcely approaches what we know to be the most optimistic scenario in the realm of cultural diversity. And the great indicator of that, of course, is language loss. When each of you were born, there were 7,000 languages spoken on Earth. Now, language isn't just a body of a vocabulary or a set of grammatical structures. A language is a flash to the human spirit. It's a vehicle through which the soul of every culture comes into the material world. Every language is an old-growth forest of the mind, a watershed of thought, an ecosystem of social and spiritual possibilities. And of those 7,000 languages, by absolute academic consensus, today, half aren't being whispered into the ears of infants. Now, there are many who say, well, wouldn't the world be a better place if we all spoke one language? Wouldn't communication be facilitated? My answer to that is always to say, what a great idea. But let's make that universal language Inuktitut. Let's make it Haida. Let's make it Tibetan. And you begin to feel, as a native speaker of English, what it would be like to be enveloped in silence, to have no ability to pass on the wisdom of your ancestry or to anticipate the promise of your descendants. And yet that is the fate of someone every 2 weeks, because on average, every fortnight somewhere on Earth, an elder dies and carries with him or her into the grave the last syllables of an ancient tongue. So we're living through an era, by any definition, half of humanity's knowledge is at risk. And the reason it's so poignant that it's happening in this moment, because this is the moment when geneticists have finally proven the philosophers to be true. We really are all brothers and sisters. And I say that not in the spirit of hippie ethnography. I mean, quite literally, studies of the human genome have left no doubt whatsoever that the genetic endowment of humanity is a continuum. Race is an utter fiction. We're all cut from the same genetic cloth. We're all descendants of that same handful of hominids who walked out of Africa some 70,000 years ago and embarked on this extraordinary hijira, 2,500 human generations that carried the human spirit to every corner of the habitable world. But here's the important revelation. If we're all cut from the same genetic cloth, it means, by definition, that virtually all cultures share the essential same raw human genius. And whether that genius is invested into technological wizardry, which has been the great success of the West, or by contrast, placed into the challenge of unraveling the myth, the threads of memory inherent in a myth, as might be the case in Australia, is simply a matter of choice and cultural orientation. There is no hierarchy in the affairs of culture. The notion of primitive makes no sense whatsoever. That old Victorian idea that we went from the savage to the barbarian to the civilized of the Strand of London has been absolutely debunked by modern science and been shown to be an artifact of the 19th century, as distant from our lives and as irrelevant to our lives as a notion that clergymen held in that era that the earth was but 6,000 years old. And this stunning affirmation of the human spirit, genetics, the hardest of the hard science, has come to the fore to affirm the central intuition of Franz Boas, the avatar of American anthropology. And that is the fact that we're all interconnected in the same single realm of social, cultural, human endeavor. And what this really means, of course, is that the other peoples of the world aren't failed attempts at being new. They're not failed attempts at being modern. Every culture is a unique answer to a fundamental question. What does it mean to be human and alive? And when the peoples of the world answer that question, they do so in the 7,000 voices of humanity. And those answers, collectively, become our human repertoire for dealing with the challenges that will confront us as a species in the coming centuries. This is the lesson of anthropology. Every culture has something to say, each deserves to be heard, just as none has a monopoly on the route to the divine. Ruth Benedict, Franz Boas's great student, said it very simply: the purpose of anthropology is to make the world safe for human differences. But the question is, what do you do about it? You know, if you're a botanist or a zoologist and you identify an area of high species endemism, you can create a park, a protected area, but you can't make a rainforest park of the mind. You can't freeze people in time and space like some kind of zoological specimen. After all, change is the one constant of the human experience. Every culture, everywhere, is always dancing with new possibilities for life. So when I was recruited about 2000 as an explorer in residence of the National Geographic and given the audacious mission of changing the way the world viewed and valued culture in a decade, it was a challenge. We knew that polemics are never persuasive. We know politicians never do anything. But we do know that storytellers can change the world. And we were the greatest storytelling institution in the world. So I suggested to this society that they just send me out into the ethnosphere, not to celebrate the exotic other, but to show those stories of culture that are so incredibly dazzling in terms of the genius of the people that you can't help but come away with a new appreciation of the diversity of the human spirit as brought in being by culture. So let's begin with the greatest culture sphere on Earth, Polynesia. Tens of thousands of islands flung like jewels in the southern seas. I was fortunate to be invited to sail on the Hokulea, the sacred canoe of Hawaii, the Polynesian Voyaging Society that have rebirthed the entire dream of Polynesia. And even today, their sailors can name 250 stars in the night sky. They can sense the presence of distant atolls of islands beyond the visible horizon simply by watching the reverberation of waves across the hull of the vessel, knowing full well that every island group has its own refractive pattern that can be read with the perspicacity of which forensic scientists would read a fingerprint. In the darkness in the hull, they can distinguish as many as 5 different swells coming through the canoe, distinguishing those caused by local weather patterns from the deep currents that pulsate across the Pacific and be followed with the ease with which a terrestrial explorer would follow a river to the sea. Indeed, if you took all of the genius that allowed us to put a man on the moon and applied it to an understanding of the ocean, what you would have is Polynesia. Now, if we slip from the greatest ocean sphere into the greatest forest, we enter the homeland of the people of the anaconda, the Amazon, a forest the size of the face of the full moon. People like the Barasana and the Makuna, who believe that mythologically they came out the Milk River from the east, who do not distinguish the color blue from the color green because cognitively they believe that the canopy of the heavens is equated to the canopy of the stars. Or we come down into the homeland of the Warani, remarkable tribe I lived with in the late 1970s, remarkable because they had only been peacefully contacted in 1958. In 1957, 5 missionaries attempted contact and made a critical mistake. They dropped from the air 8x10 glossy photographs that we would say showed us in friendly postures. They had never seen anything two-dimensional in their lives. They picked up the photographs from the forest floor, looked behind the face to try to form, found nothing, and speared the 5 missionaries to death. But they also speared each other. 54% of their mortality amongst men was intra-tribal spearing raids. But they had a knowledge of the forest that was incredible. Their hunters could smell animal urine at 40 paces and tell you what form of life had left it behind. And that knowledge is what we went in search of as botanical explorers. I was very fortunate to go to Harvard and fall into the orbit of the legendary Richard Evans Schultes, the man who sparked the psychedelic era with his discovery of the magic mushrooms in 1938. He later disappeared in the forests of the northwest Amazon, where he remained for 12 uninterrupted years. Mountains now bear his name, as do national parks. I rapped on his door. He was such an Anglophile that a colleague once said the only way for Schultes to go native would be go to London. And I knocked on his door at the age of 18. I got as far as saying, "Sir, I'm from British Columbia. I want to go to the Amazon. I saved up money in a logging camp. I want to go to the Amazon, collect plants." He thought I was talking British. That caught him. And then Columbia, he thought his beloved Columbia. So he simply looked across a mound of plant specimens and said, "Well, son, when do you want to go?" And I was in the Amazon 2 weeks later, where I stayed for a year and a half. But before I left, he said, "Always remember the difference between a poison, narcotic, hallucinogen, and medicine is just dosage." And that brings us to, this is curare, of course, the flying death, the arrow poison used for hunting technologies in the Amazon, but of course it yielded D-tubocurarin, the muscle relaxant that revolutionized abdominal surgery in the 1940s. And this all brought us into the realm of the shaman. And if you follow the work of great ethnographers like Shirley MacLaine, you would think that the shaman, has feathers and bells and sings. I've been with shaman all of my life, and I haven't been with one who wasn't a little psychotic. That's their job. They're the ones who swim in the mystic waters the rest of us would drown in. And the shaman act as a healer, physician, priest. Very often the job is more analogous to that of an engineer who goes into the heart of the nuclear reactor to reprogram the world. And this accounts for, in shamanic healing, diseases aren't seen as symptoms, but as something at the core of the individual, an imbalance that must be addressed. And that accounts for one of the most strangest anomalies in botanical science. Of the 120 known hallucinogenic plants, 95% are from the Americas. Not because the forests of Southeast Asia are depauperate, but because there they have other roots to the divine. In the Americas, these curious plants were the conduit to the Godhead. Plants like this one, in this photograph Schultes took in 1954, Ebene, the semen of the sun. These powders blown up your nose is like being shot out of a rifle barrel lined with Baroque paintings and landing on a sea of electricity. It doesn't create a distortion of reality, it creates a disillusion of reality. But what we're interested in, not just their pharmacological effects, because the shaman must invoke these techniques of ecstasy to get into these metaphysical realms where they can work their deeds of rescue, but what do they tell us about a different way of knowing? The Yanomami put those snuffs up the nose for a simple reason. The active ingredients, 5-methoxydimethyltryptamine, dimethyltryptamine, are orally inactive. They can't be taken through the mouth. They can only be taken if they're taken in conjunction with some other drug which will temporarily denature the monoamine oxidase found in the human stomach. Now, you don't have to worry about any of this chemistry, but here's the cool thing. In ayahuasca, you've all heard of that, the vision vine, the active ingredient are the leaves in this nondescript shrub in the coffee family, full of these tryptamines. The liana is full of beta-carbolines that potentiate the tryptamines. But here's the obvious question: how? In a flora of 80,000 species of asteroid plants, did they learn to combine these morphologically distinct denizens of the rainforest to create this biological version of the sum, the whole being greater than the sum of the parts? The only scientific explanation is trial and error, which statistically is quickly exposed as a meaningless euphemism. You ask the Indians, and they say, the plants teach us. Well, what does that mean? We also know now that the Bodhisattva actually are the descendants of the great civilizations of the Northwest Amazon that Aurelianus saw in 1541, living in these immense malokas with social structures based on knowledge and exchange, that facilitate not war and conflict, as in the case of the Warani, but peace and trade. One of the rules is that you must marry someone who speaks a different language. And so in any one longhouse, you have 6 and 7 languages spoken, but you never hear a child practicing. They simply wait, listen, and begin to speak. And ayahuasca is used as an avenue to the divine in these great rituals that bring together neighboring tribes, and then the individuals take yahe and actually become not symbols of the ancestors, but literally become ancestral beings who travel to all the points of the cosmos as they reaffirm their central intuition in life, and that is that plants and animals are but people in another dimension of reality. Now, if we slip up into the mountains of the Andes, we can explore this notion of sacred geography. You know, you and I were raised to believe that a mountain is a pile of rock, right? My godchildren in the Andes were raised to believe it's an Apu deity that will direct their destiny. It's not about who's right and who's wrong, but think of the consequences in terms of the ecological footprint of the society. In the Andes, everything is based on reciprocity. Human beings aren't the problem, we're the solutions, because we're the only ones that can maintain the equilibrium of the world. Every mountain is an Apu deity that will direct your destiny. And they acknowledge this in ritual. Everything from the economy to the spirit realm is based on a notion of reciprocity and exchange. The earth owes its bounty to humans, humans by turn owe their protection to the earth. And this is not idle rhetoric. This is my godson, and once each year outside of Cusco, an amazing event happens called Movimiento. The fastest young boy in every hamlet is given the honor of becoming the Huaylaca, and he dresses in the clothing of his sister, and he leads all able-bodied men on a run, but it's not your ordinary run. You start off at 11,500 feet, you run 2,000 feet down the sacred mountain of Antiquilca, and then you storm up to 16,000 feet, only to fall away across two more soaring Andean ridges over a 24-hour event that is more ritual than race. And the metaphor is so beautiful. You go into the mountain as an individual, but through sacrifice, and sacrifice in Latin means to make sacred, you fuse into a single body that once again is affirmed both your ownership of the land and your obligations to the land. And at the age of 48, in what was one of my many midlife crises, according to my wife, I became the only outsider and the oldest man to do and complete this run. And I did so only by chewing more coca leaves in one day than anyone in the 4,000-year history of the planet. Actually, what happened, I had baptized maybe 20 kids in that village, and I had raised them all through school and bought cows and pencils and everything. And when all my ahijados, the godchildren, learned that their padrino, their godfather, was stupid enough to run the movimiento at that age, they clung to me throughout the day like limpets. They weren't going to let anything happen to their cash cow. But these events become almost pan-Andean, like the Coiriti. Here, a perfect fusion of Catholic and pre-Columbian ideas, tens of thousands of native people converging on a sacred valley, bringing the crosses from their communities up into the mountains, in the shadow of Ausangati, the most sacred peak of the Andes, planting the crosses in the ice to absorb the power of Pachamama, then to be withdrawn and carried back down to empower the community for another year. All of these ritual gestures. Now, this is an amazing story. If there's one place in South America where the pre-Columbian voice can still be heard, it's the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta, the isolated volcanic massif that rises above the coastal Caribbean plain of Colombia. There, the descendants of the ancient Tairona civilization, the Arahuacos, the Wiwa, and the Kogi, live today in a blood-stained continent in a state of freedom. They have never been fully conquered. To this day, they remain ruled by a ritual priesthood. But according to an ethnographer who was there in the 1940s, the training for the priesthood is austere in the extreme. The acolytes are taken away from their families at the age of 2 and 3, sequestered in a shadowy world of darkness for 18 years, during which they are enculturated in the values of their Baroque religiosity, and then which maintains the idea that their rituals and prayers are literally responsible for the well-being of the earth. And after all of this training, one day they are simply taken out into the dawn for the first time, and they see the glory of the earth as it is. And they're taken on this pilgrimage from the sea to the ice and the ice back to the sea, as the priest who has trained them says, you see, it really is as beautiful as we've been saying all these years. It's yours to protect. Now, this was an ecological fable in anthropology because Reichel Dolmatov never saw the ritual. And this man walked in my office at National Geographic with the Colombian ambassador, and he was pitching a film idea. They're very hip and politically adept. And he had 3 mamos with him, all barefoot in the Washington winter. And I looked at this kid, and I said, look, Danilo, I don't mean to be rude, but you look an awful lot like an old friend of mine. It turns out, I said, and I pulled out a photograph of his father, who was murdered by the FARC. And when he was an infant, I carried him on my back for weeks with his dad when I first was in the Sierra in 1974. I said, you may not remember, Alberto, but I carried you for weeks. And then he began weeping and weeping, and based on that unbelievable connection, he invited us to come back with a film crew, not only to speak about the journey to the heart of the world, but to make a film about it. And what we discovered is that today, the acolytes don't spend 18 years in the darkness. They spend 18 years around the men's temple, much of it at night during the training sessions. And indeed, they do a journey to the heart of the world. And it's just as Reichel described. And we did this journey, and at the penultimate stage, where every ripple in the landscape resonates with mythological significance, as we got to the ultimate stage, the mamos were in a circle. And when they pray, they believe their prayers are threads. So they move their fingers like this, and they were all praying. And what had happened is a FARC patrol had come down to try to kidnap us, because our agenda was well known in the mountains. And we had just come in late to that hamlet when the FARC were going over the hill. So we had to abandon the film. We let the Wiwa filmmakers finish it, and then we had to escape in the middle of the night. You don't really have any dramatic escape on a mule. You kind of clip-clop your way to rescue. But we got back down in the middle of a firefight, and even though modern Colombia is upon their land, it doesn't stop the elder brother doing what they've always done, praying for our collective well-being. They call themselves the elder brothers who have protected the world for all time, and they dismiss the rest of us who they see as ruining the world as the younger brothers. And they speak in full paragraphs and sentences about our need to change our ways. Well, I've always lived by the adage of Picasso that if it works, it's obsolete. And after 4 years in the Andes and the Amazon, I was curious about and there was always something waiting in Schulte's office. So in February of 1982, he summoned me to his office and asked me casually if I was interested in going down to the island nation of Haiti, infiltrating the secret societies, and securing the formula of a drug used to make zombies. Well, of course, I said, yeah. And I thought it was going to be a 2-week lark. It ended up consuming 4 years of my life. And the key thing here is to emphasize that the purpose of anthropology is not to rationalize every human activity, as every human activity deserves to exist. It's rather it never calls for the elimination of judgment. Anthropology calls for the suspension of judgment, so the ethical and moral choices and decisions and judgments that we must make can be informed. Why do we think of voodoo as evil? If I asked you to name the great religions of the world, what continent's left out? Voodoo is simply a fond word from Dahomey, that means spirit or God. It's simply the religious belief system of West Africa. In many ways, it's a quintessential democratic faith, because the believer doesn't simply have communication with the God, they become the God. As the Haitians used to say, you white people go to church and speak about God, we dance in the temple and become God. And it is this moment of spirit possession that for them is not a psychotic moment, but rather the hand of divine grace. And that's why you see these theatrical gestures slicing into the skin in front of a fetish symbol in Togo, or here more profoundly, acolytes in Haiti in a state of trance, handling burning embers with impunity, an astonishing example of the mind's ability to affect the body that bears it when catalyzed in a state of extreme excitation. But we have this idea that all these cultures, quaint and colorful as they are somehow destined to fade away, don't we? As if they're failed attempts at keeping up, failed attempts at being modern. Nothing could be further from the truth. Technology is no threat to culture. Change is no threat to culture. What is a threat to culture is power. In every instance, these aren't failing societies. These are dynamic, living societies being driven out of existence by identifiable forces. And that's actually an optimistic observation, because it suggests if human beings are the agents of cultural destruction, we can be the facilitators of cultural survival. My first book about zombies became a horrible Hollywood movie. And when Hemingway said, if you sell a book to Hollywood, you start off in Arizona, drive to the California state line, throw the book over, and then go back to Tucson and have a drink. I didn't do that. I disappeared in the forests of Borneo. I wanted to live in a place wet with the innocence of birth. I wanted to live with nomadic people, the Penan, the last nomads of Southeast Asia. Nomadic societies are profoundly different. Think about it. How do you measure wealth in a community where everything has to be carried and there's a disincentive to acquire anything? Wealth is explicitly defined as a strength of social relations between people, because if they fray, everybody suffers. There is no word for thank you in the Penan language, because everything is reflexively shared. I once gave a cigarette to a little old woman and watched as she tore it apart to distribute the individual strands of tobacco equitably to every hut in the encampment, rendering the product useless, honoring her obligation to share. And these non-written traditions have a kind of strange relationship such that with natural world, such that the flight of a hornbill becomes a kind of cursive script of nature, like a vocabulary written on the wind. But now, of course, the sounds, even when I was there in the 80s, are of machinery, the highest rate of tropical deforestation on Earth, and in a single generation, rivers that once ran clear are so laden with silt that it seems as if half of Sarawak has been slipped away to the South China Seas where the freighters wait for the logs. Women forced into prostitution, destitution, servitude, young children suffering from ailments never known in the history of the people, men humiliated every day, standing up in a quixotic gesture, blowpipes against bulldozers, no match for the power of the Malaysian state. And in a single generation, I witnessed a way of life morally inspired, inherently right, crushed along with the forest that had given its birth. And this industrialization of the wild comes from our specific worldview of the West. And to show that there are alternatives, let's go to the other end, or the other extreme of imagination, and enter the deserts of Australia. Now, when the British first arrived in Australia, they saw a people that looked strange, who had a simple material technology. But what really offended the British is that the Aboriginal civilization of Australia had no interest whatsoever on improving their lot. And because optimism, progress, improvement was the ethos of Europe during the time of the settlement, the British, in their inimitable way, concluded the Aborigines weren't human at all. Can you believe it? As recently as 1902, it was debated in Parliament in Melbourne as to whether or not Abos were human. As recently as the 1950s, white ranchers had quotas as to how many Abos they could kill with impunity who trespassed upon their land. As recently as the 1960s, a school book used throughout the curriculum of Australia, a Treasury of Fauna of Australia, listed the Aboriginal people as amongst the interesting forms of wildlife of the country. What was missing was a failure of the British to understand, sense a devotional philosophy so subtle it was extraordinary, and that was the dreaming. The dreaming's not a dream. It's the idea that the world at your feet both exists and is eternally waiting to be born. The purpose of life in Australia was the antithesis of progress. It was purposeful. The Australian people didn't want to improve on anything. Their goal, quite to the contrary, was stasis, constancy. Their whole purpose in life was to do the ritual gestures necessary to maintain the world exactly as it was at the time of its creation, during the era of the rainbow serpent, when the ancestors walked the song lines and sang the world into existence. Now, again, it's almost like all Western thought went into pruning the shrubs in the Garden of Eden to keep it just as it was when Adam and Eve had that fateful conversation. Again, I'm not saying who's right and who's wrong. Had we followed that intellectual trajectory, we wouldn't have put a man on the moon, but we also wouldn't be talking about global climate change on a planet imperiled. So, if industrial intrusions can be one threat to culture, a far more pernicious one is ideology, be it the ubiquitous myth of modernity or the hideous, hateful materialism of Marx, Mao, and Stalin. You know, I spent a lot of time in Buddhist areas. Here at at Angkor Wat, when I first went to Angkor Wat, the strangest thing I just couldn't find anyone my age, right? Because they've all been killed. And this is a woman I found who had had her feet and hands sliced from her body for the sin of pursuing her religious faith. And if we go into the mountains of Tibet, where I spent a great deal of time, we'll see what happened in the fateful wake of Mao Zedong, the man who incidentally was responsible for the murder of more of his own people in his lifetime than Hitler and Stalin combined, when he said to a young Dalai Lama, "All religion is poison." His Holiness knew what to expect. And when the jackboot of the Red Guard crushed Lhasa in 1959, as many as 2 million people were killed. 6,000 religious monuments were simply obliterated. And what was it about the Buddhist Dharma that so threatened the Marxist materialists of Beijing? All life, the Four Noble Truths, all life is suffering. By the Buddha didn't mean that all life was negative. He just meant that terrible things happen. The second noble truth is that the cause of suffering is ignorance. By that, the Buddha didn't mean stupidity, but the tendency of human beings to cling to the cruel illusion of our own centrality in the stream of divine existence. The third of the noble truths was a revelation that ignorance could be overcome, and the fourth and most consequential was the delineation of a contemplative practice that, if followed, didn't just have a possibility of the transformation of the human heart, it had 2,500 years of empirical evidence that that transformation would in fact occur. So we wanted to make a film called The Buddhist Science of the Mind. And I was very fortunate to travel with this remarkable man, Mathieu Ricard. I don't know if you've heard of him. He's a translator of the Dalai Lama in Europe, but more incredible is his background. His father was France's greatest Descartesian philosopher. His mother was a famous painter. He grew up in a house of luminaries. If you can believe it, he learned piano from Stravinsky. He learned photography from Cartier-Bresson. He learned anthropology at the feet of Claude Lévi-Strauss. He himself was a molecular biologist working in the lab of a Nobel laureate at the Pasteur Institute when one day he realized there was no correlation between fame, wealth, and happiness. So he went back to the one place he had always been happy, became ordained as a Tibetan monk. And to spend 2 months in the Himalaya with Mathieu was like being in Sherwood Forest with Friar Tuck. And also with us was Sher Barma, a traditional Amshi doctor, seen here quizzically examining my urine sample. And we were blessed by the late Trulsuk Rinpoche, who was the man who inherited the Rongbuk Monastery and moved it over into Nepal after the Chinese took Tibet. And our mission was not to, we were moving up into the Himalaya to meet a hero, not a Western hero, not the climbers who slog to the flanks of Everest and then crawl up into a zone of oxygen deprivation known as the death zone simply to set foot on a piece of rock, which at risk of their entire incarnation, which to the Buddhists is just about the stupidest thing you could do. We are in search of a real Buddhist hero, a Bodhisattva. This woman, as a young girl, had been incredibly beautiful, forced into marriage because of her looks, the poverty of her family. She couldn't bear it. She wanted a life of the Dharma. She escaped the clutches of this wealthy merchant by crawling down a human latrine. Covered with excrement, she turned up at the stoop of the Timbuktu Monastery, where the lamas cleaned her up and dispatched her over the 19,000-foot Nangpala Pass into Tibet, where she became ordained as a Tibetan nun. She then crossed back over and went into lifelong retreat. She became a Sasampa Ani, and for 45 years she had lived in a cell no bigger than this stage, dedicating her entire sentient existence to the recitation of a single mantra. Now, because she was elderly and Sherab was a doctor, he was looking after her, and that gave us the opportunity to meet her. So we began at the Siwon Monastery that clings like a swallow's nest to the mountains of southern Nepal, the southern face of the Himalaya. The Mani Rimdu ceremony that in 18 days commemorates the transmission of the Dharma to Tibet in the era of Guru Rinpoche. And then we began this slow ascent into the heights of the Himalaya, all with this quest in mind to meet this woman. We went by the cave whereby, as part of his 7 years of medical training, Sherab had spent 1 full year in solitary retreat. And as Mathieu would chant the sutras, we'd come closer and closer to this moment. Now, by all our terms of reference, the woman's face, who we'll see in a moment, the photograph, the instant the door opened on her face for the first time in 45 years, you would think she should be insane. But the face that in fact greeted us radiated loving compassion. She immediately gave away all merit for her devotions to all sentient beings. This is a bodhisattva. The bodhisattva is the one who's achieved enlightenment but chooses to remain in the realm of samsara, specifically to facilitate the liberation of other human beings. This is the bodhisattva ideal, which is so unique to Mahayana Buddhism. And we stayed with her for 45 minutes. She took Mathieu to task for the unnecessarily Baroque rituals all these male monks do. And then she simply retreated to her devotions. Now, later, Mathieu said to me, you see, Wade, this is the proof of the efficacy of the science of the mind of Tibetan Buddhism, the serenity achieved by the practitioner. And later that night at a nearby monastery, a lama said to me, you know, we in Tibet don't believe that you went to the moon, but you did. You may not believe that we achieve enlightenment in one lifetime, but we do. So it leaves it to us the Tibetans chart their way forward with the Diamond Sutra, the idea that life is ephemeral. It's like a candle in the wind. It's like the dawn yielding to the day. And they leave it to us to ask the obvious question: why do we continue to tolerate the wrath of China as it does so much to dismantle and destroy a religious and cultural tradition that has done so much for the world? So in the end, we kind of have to ask ourselves a question: what kind of world do we want to live in? A monochromatic world of monotony or a polychromatic world of diversity? Margaret Mead said her greatest fear was that as we drifted toward this blandly amorphous generic world culture, not only would the entire range of the human spirit be reduced to a more narrow modality of thought, but we would wake one day as from a dream, forgetting that there are other possibilities for life itself. The idea isn't to freeze people in time or to go to some pre-industrial past ourselves. The question is, how do we move forward? How do we achieve? Every human culture has access to all the genius of modernity, science, medicine, critically without that engagement implying the death of their culture. And the reason this is important is not simply human rights or decency, geopolitical stability. If there's one lesson of anthropology, it's that culture is not trivial. Culture is not the songs we sing, the prayers we utter, the clothes. Ultimately, culture everywhere is a body of moral and ethical values that we wrap around every human being to keep at bay the barbaric heart that history teaches lies within all of us. It is culture that allows us to make sense out of sensation, find order and meaning in the universe. Do as Lincoln said, seek the better angels of our nature. And if you want to know what happens when culture is lost, and by volition or coercion people are cast in a world of uncertainty, alienation, disaffection, you simply have to look at the points of conflict around the world, the photos of the dead in the Genocide Museum in Kigali. Fortunately, nation states are waking up to the fact that Indigenous people don't embarrass a nation state, they enrich it if the state's prepared to tolerate diversity and pluralism. My own country of Canada does not have a good record with the Inuit. When the British first arrived in the Arctic, the Inuit took the British to be gods. The British took the Inuit to be savages. Both were wrong. What the British failed to understand was that there was no better measure of human genius than the ability to survive in a harsh environment where there was no wood and everything had to be forged from the cold. The Inuit don't fear the cold, they take advantage of it. The runners of their sleds were originally made of fish, 3 Arctic char laid in a row and wrapped in a caribou skin. They didn't fear the cold, they took advantage of it. This is when I was polar bear hunting out about 250 miles on the ice. That night the temperature dropped to minus 65 Celsius before the wind came up. Our skidoo broke down and I would have died if I hadn't been with these men and we hadn't been able to build an igloo. Curiously, that exact experience happened to Franz Boas, and that was the seed of the birth of anthropology. He realized he wasn't a superior European man when he was with the Inuit. They knew so much more. And the blood on ice, I have to say this for any Greenpeace fans, of which I'm not, in the Arctic is not a sign of death, it's an affirmation of life itself. And the idea of the ice informs the entire cosmos of the Inuit people. The word in the Greenlandic, in Inuktitut in Greenland is sila, means both weather and consciousness, right? So it's, as the ice recedes, it affects the spirit of the Inuit people themselves. And now, having endured so much in such a short time, disease, welfare system, culture of poverty, missionaries, everything and more, they are finally on the edge of this cultural revival, but they're now dealing with something they cannot control, and that is climate change. This is a photograph taken in the northernmost community in the world, the only community to have banned skidoos and keep their dogs, 30,000 dogs in this community. Normally the ice would come in September and stay until July. Now it comes in November and is gone by March. Their entire world is literally melting from beneath them. But just to end on a positive note, in the immediate wake of 9/11, I wanted to tell a story of Islam. You remember there was so much hysteria. So we traveled to the Sahara, Western Africa, through Mali, passing through the homeland of the Dogon to reach the great Islamic centers of Jannah and, of course, Timbuktu. Now, Timbuktu, at a time when Paris and London were mud hovels, was a city with 25,000 students in it. It was a center of Islamic knowledge, rivaling Damascus and Cairo and Baghdad. And it was sort of the port on the edge of the sea of sand of the Western Sahara. And even to this day, in Timbuktu, you can read these monographs on cosmology, botany, mathematics, philosophy that reveal this extraordinary realm of knowledge. In fact, the only reason the knowledge of the ancient Greeks survived to inform the Renaissance was that it was held in the literary traditions of the great Islamic scholars like Avicenna. Well, we didn't just go to Timbuktu, we wanted to go north from Timbuktu to an ancient salt mine where salt had been taken out of the ground for over 800 years, salt that once traded ounce for gold with the gold of West Africa. Remember that until the discovery of the New World, 2/3 of Europe's gold came from West Africa, overland 52 days from Timbuktu to Marrakesh, and that was the route that we retraced. We wanted to go to this ancient salt mine. And all of these young Berber and Tamashek cannot marry if they have not done the pilgrimage to the mine. It is said that the desert hones their sensibilities. And as we moved our way north, we just picked up this assemblage of people. We had to have some security because we were in the middle of the Tuareg rebellion, but I don't even know who these guys came from. But I love the fact that every 5 times a day, they would turn to Mecca and, in the absence of water, wash their hands with the desert sand. When we got to the mine itself, it was an absolutely biblical scene. My friend Isa Muhammad, this massive tour guide, took one look and said, "I would not bring my wife here." And when I asked some of the smugglers what country they came from, they said, "There are no countries here." And we had an encounter with this man, which I'll never forget. He was chronologically younger than me, but physically broken and spiritually distraught. He had gotten to debt in the classic system of debt peonage in order to save the life of his child. And he had been in the pits of the mine for years. And he, in fact, was the only person in the oral history of the mine who stayed out throughout the entire summer, where it got so hot, they said, prophetically, probably the sand melted. He lived in a hut made only of blocks of sand. His only possessions were the ragged burmoose on his body and a rusted tin with this brackish fresh water in it. And it turns out, I looked at his production and the fees he could make for the salt he could dig. This man was never going to escape peonage. And yet his entire debt was less than a dinner for 4 here in Rancho Mirage. So my friend Chris and I gave him the money. He blessed Allah. And then as we walked away, a sandstorm swept across the entire mine site and enveloped him in a haze of yellow mist. We never knew what happened to him. Did he get home? Was he robbed for the money and killed? Was he lying to us? We just never knew. But he blessed us. And then as we went south, we found a caravan we had seen coming north that had got stranded in the desert because an unusual thunderstorm had broken open the Sahara sky. If the salt gets wet, it breaks and loses all value. So this entire caravan, 10 camels, 8 men, all the wealth of their families, had to simply sit and wait for the salt to dry. They were down to a single liter of water, and they were 250 miles from a well. As we came upon him, this man was walking off 25 miles in the desert where they thought there was a depression where they might be able to dig for water. Now, in the desert, you can live for 3 weeks without food. Death by thirst or dehydration comes overnight. Those same smugglers at the mine used to say to me, the great thing about the brake fluid is it keeps you off the battery acid. And so as we came upon these men, down to 1 liter of water, what did they do? They immediately kindled a twig fire and brewed us tea with that water, honoring the obligation of the Bedouin to always kill the last goat that gives the milk that keeps your children alive to feed a wandering stranger who comes in out of the desert alone, cold, hungry, in need of shelter, because you never know when you will be that person. And I can promise you, as I watched Muhammad pour me this first cup of tea, I thought to myself, after 50 years of working in anthropology, these are the moments that allow us all to hope. Thank you very much.